The following program is a production of Ozarks Public Television.
Empowerment, the electrification of the Ozarks. The creation, harnessing, and distribution of electricity might said to be one of mankind's greatest and most impacting achievements. It's a convenience and catalyst we frequently take for granted, giving little thought or awareness to its history, manufacture, and impact. Electricity is affordable and fundamental to contemporary American life. People have known and studied electricity since ancient times, but it was only in the late 1870s when Thomas Edison's experiments resulted in the switch being turned on in a practical and for everyone life-affecting way.
Edison invented the incandescent light bulb, which provided the illumination of homes in urban America, replacing natural gas, which was less satisfactory. And we would also have the illumination of factories, which was very important because it enabled factories to operate on a 24-hour basis. In factories now, electricity ran the machines rather than steam, which was an improvement. Electricity was also used to service the streetcars, which enabled workers to travel about the cities. Again, all of this occurred in the cities, and throughout this period, rural America was pretty much ignored.
There's a tremendous time span between the earliest introduction of electricity and the last of the backwoods rural people getting electricity. You're talking about basically from the 1880s into the 1960s, if you can believe that long. You're talking about basically 80 years that it takes to get everybody electrified.
Butler, Missouri claims to be the first community in Missouri to have electric power. Records indicate the city enjoying electric lights beginning December 6, 1881. It wasn't long before St. Louis, Springfield, and Joplin followed.
Well, of course, one of the first big noticeable things was the electric streetcars. Springfield got their electric streetcars in 1891, which was fairly early, one of the first cities west of the Mississippi to have them. And I think a lot of that has to do with the tremendous buildup of infrastructure brought about by the division between Springfield and North Springfield. They were both trying to kind of outdo each other in those types of things, having all the amenities of a big city, North Springfield being a railroad town, Springfield being the county seat. Springfield came up with the electric plant, which was down on Main Street, and it had sidelines because the generation of the electricity was done with steam, and that steam then became a resource, and they sold the steam off to the businesses downtown so that they didn't have to have dangerous boilers inside their buildings. And then right next to it was the coal gasification plant, where they turned coal into natural gas. The city was so eager to show itself as modern and on the move and on the grow that even after the two cities merged together in 1887, they continued to really grow and develop.
It would seem that running power lines and connecting people and businesses would be done in a planned and progressive manner, but economics and resources dictated that Springfield and other cities were not always connected to electricity in a geographically or organized way.
It was all higgledy-piggledy. Whenever you could afford to do it, you did it, and you took great pride in it, and the city took great pride in continuing to add things.
Springfield's downtown square became the centerpiece and showcase of the city's progressiveness and the community building and glowing warmth provided by electricity.
The Gottfried Tower was put in the center of the square as kind of a beacon light. It had the Statue of Liberty on top and had these big yard arms that supported all the cables for the electric streetcars, and then it had electric lights on it. So it wasn't a very bright light, but it lit up the square and gave it a real sense of being modern.
Natural showmen, theater owners utilize the glamour and allure of electricity in promoting their locations, one of these sites being the Electric Theater in Springfield's downtown square.
And the marquee was huge. At that time, there was no neon. They had just running bulbs and just hundreds of bulbs to light up the marquee that lit up that whole corner of the square.
Springfield, the Queen City of the Ozarks, unquestionably sparkled during these early years of electrification.
It had to be like going to a place like Las Vegas. It really had to, with all the light and the color and everything that was going on and all the activities.
Organizationally, electric, gas, water, and transportation remained independent utilities in Springfield until the 1940s. Today, these entities are provided by City Utilities, a community-owned utility. State-of-the-art facilities are responsible for the generation, transmission, and distribution of electrical power to the city of Springfield and parts of Greene and Christian counties. In the late 19th century and early 20th, it was also not unusual for private companies, often owned by New York money interests, to provide power to communities, often building their own dams and power generation plants.
The really ambitious, progressive power companies wanted to use hydroelectricity. They wanted to harness what some people called white coal in the early 20th century. And the Ozarks had all these rushing rivers and streams, and it seemed to be a perfect place for this. One of the earliest hydroelectric plants that I know of in the Ozarks was in the Joplin area.
The organization that broke ground on Lowell Dam in 1904 and constructed a power plant to serve the communities and mining companies was Spring River Power Company.
That was very important for that area because it was the booming tri-state mining area, and so electricity was important for the mining companies to use and for the booming town of Joplin and these other places around it.
As power needs from the mining companies quickly grew, a new power plant at Riverton, Kansas was placed into operation by 1906, its generator having an earlier and unique role in Missouri history.
What was interesting about their first generator was it was nicknamed Old Kate, and it came from the 1904 World's Fair, and it powered the World's Fair in St. Louis.
An early and influential power provider to Joplin and the surrounding area is Empire District Electric Company. Formed in 1909 and with 15 shareholders from New York, the Empire State, it remains a major power provider to the city of Joplin and surrounding communities.
When Empire is formed, electricity is just very foreign. It's on a few signs in Joplin area. There's very few homes that are powered by it. And so it's a very novel concept at this point in time. But as they move into the teens and prior to World War I, electricity becomes more available, and they start looking at the transportation system. The interurban, the trolley system that connects the tri-state mining district, the communities together, had to be powered by electricity too. So that's the next thing they jumped on board was the Southwest Missouri Railway Company. Then they're starting to look into the homes and the manufacturing plants and the companies that are doing, or businesses that they can power.
Earlier in 1899, the citizens of Joplin had voted to approve their own $30,000 plant to provide electricity to the city.
But by the 20s, they have another vote, and the citizens determined that it would be great for Empire just to take over all the street lighting, entire city venture, and therefore from then on, Empire controls the entire lighting business and electricity needs for the community of Joplin. But it's just interesting that when you tell the story of Empire, you tell the story of the Tri-State Mining District, and you tell the story of Joplin, it is so interconnected that it's hard to pull either one out.
Perhaps most of all, the mines in the region were naturally and strongly impacted by the access to electricity.
And you know, the whole idea of 24-hour shifts in the mines was incredibly valuable. The large companies were open 24 hours of business, but they obviously had to see underground. No one knows what dark is until you are 100 feet down below the surface. Electricity was needed for to power the drills that allowed to penetrate those tough limestone walls, then to stuff it with dynamite to blow it up so we could get those rich minerals of lead and zinc to the surface.
In addition to lighting homes, improving transportation, and powering and increasing the output of the mining industries, electricity also allowed for additional recreational opportunities for mining employees and other residents, one of these being Joplin's historic electric park on the site of today's Schifferdecker Park.
It was supposed to be somewhat of a miniature Coney Island amusement park where there were rides and there were concession stands and there was entertainment. One thing you could always see was this huge tower, and it was full of incandescent lights. Well, to me, I think the tower represents the new age of electricity and the light bulb.
More important and enduring was the impact electricity had on Joplin's downtown. Local businesses flourished and the community grew.
Joplin is a Main Street city, and with that, everybody was always drawn to downtown, and downtown obviously has all the lights of the department stores, the flashing lights from the movie theaters, etc.
The warmth, brightness, and benefits of Edison's electricity research shone slowly across America. Large cities and affluent individuals might enjoy this convenience, but rural America and many areas of the Ozarks would not experience this modernization until the 1930s, when President Roosevelt and his administration organized the Rural Electrification Association.
The Depression of the 1930s, including Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal, brought rural America into the 20th century. Rural America had been largely ignored in terms of technological advances preceding this time. The unemployment rate was 25% in the Great Depression. Roosevelt had to deal with that. He provided relief programs for the unemployed. He provided reforms. But much more important to rural America were the recovery programs that Roosevelt inspired, which benefited rural America immensely. The most important of which was the Tennessee Valley Authority.
Yeah, Roosevelt had two big programs that applied to electrification. The first was the TVA, Tennessee Valley Authority. That comes in 1933. And there are a couple of reasons for that. One is utilities had been really reluctant in that part of the country to push outside the cities. It was really expensive. You know, if you think about what it takes to move transmission lines across the countryside, you might have really widely scattered farms. So it was very expensive to bring in power. You just couldn't do it economically. So utilities wouldn't do it. So government came in and set up TVA.
The TVA dammed the Tennessee River as far north as Paducah. From that point on into northern Mississippi and Alabama, 21 dams were created. As a result of that, cheap electrical power was provided to a very backward area at a time where private enterprise didn't want to do it.
It was also a public works project to provide jobs, but at the same time, it was the idea that we're just simply not going to allow half of the country to be without electricity and half the country to move forward.
The TVA program was the precursor of the REA, the Rural Electrification Administration, which was created 1 year later, 1935.
And Congress passes a series of flood control acts beginning in 1936. And all of these stipulate several dozen dams to be built. And many of these were in the Ozarks, in Missouri and Arkansas. And the two things that are always mentioned in the Flood Control Act is flood control, obviously, that's in the name, but also the generation of hydroelectricity. And especially the senators from Missouri and Arkansas and certain representatives really get into this push for some kind of equivalent Ozark equivalent of a TVA. It never happens, but with the Flood Control Act, the Army Corps of Engineers comes into the picture, and it becomes kind of like the TVA for the Ozarks.
Prior to the Great Mississippi Flood of 1927, the Army Corps of Engineers was not active in constructing dams, but the deaths, disease, and millions of dollars of destruction from this flood began to shift their efforts. The Corps of Engineers would ultimately assume the leading responsibility for constructing dams for the dual purpose of flood control and generation of hydroelectricity, becoming an important contributor to the electrification of the Ozarks. Following the advent of Roosevelt's New Deal, dam construction in the Ozarks was provided almost exclusively by the Army Corps of Engineers, a federal agency, with Truman Dam in 1979 being the last one built in the Ozarks region. In the early days, electrifying areas often came down to a simple but practical economy of scale that would typically reflect the geography and density of population of an area.
Back in those days, the power companies weren't worried about uncle and aunt so-and-so out in the country, the farmers. They were building their lines along railroads or later along highways from one city to the next. And it was only the towns that had the benefit of electricity.
There had been this realization that people were leaving the countryside. And one of the main reasons they were leaving the countryside is life in the city had become much more attractive. And that really came down to a couple of things. If you look at the city, you've got water, you've got sewer, and you've got electric. And those things really transform the way life is lived. Well, if you live in the country, you don't have that.
When I was a kid, in my home down in the Holler Liner, I lived there until about 15 years. I went to Kansas City, where they had modern electricity and everything, and I got accustomed to that before I come back home. In Kansas City, there was streetcars and street buses and things I had to get used to. And when I come back from Kansas City, well, there's no electricity yet, and it was hard to get adjusted, being used to all electric appliance and everything. And there's still no electricity back home yet. It was hard to get adjusted to that life again.
At that time, only 1 out of 10 rural families had electricity. So the REA worked very closely with the communities of the various towns and other locations to create nonprofit cooperatives, to create generating plants whereby electrical lines could be carried into the various remote neighborhoods.
Officially, the Rural Electrification Administration, the REA, was organized by Congress within the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Its goal to provide and administer loans for electrification and phone service for rural America.
The one government agency that was able to harness kind of the good feelings of the people of the rural Ozarks was the Rural Electrification Administration.
What Roosevelt did in the 1930s provided a wonderful example of what our national government can do in a time of extreme domestic emergency.
The whole reason that there was no electricity for rural people back in the 30s is there just so few people living out there. It's a very capital-intensive program to get into, and there just was no profit to be made. Companies that were in business to make a profit just couldn't see a way to extend these lines in the rural areas and get a return on their investment.
But what the Rural Electrification Administration does initially is it provides federal loan money for individuals who want to build power lines into rural areas, and then after a couple of years, they hit on this idea of concentrating on electric cooperatives.
REA was a bank. It loaned money. That was its sole purpose, what it was organized for. REA also established design standards, so you could go from any co-op in the nation, pretty much still can, and see the same kind of hardware, same line configurations, that sort of thing.
By the end of the 30s and into the 1940s, you've got these co-ops that are popping up everywhere, and they're just all over the Ozarks today.
Roughly, you could say in Missouri at least, about 1936, the first cooperatives were getting organized. Boone Electric gets the credit, beating a couple others to the courthouse by just a few days. As far as the first system to get wired, it generally took about a year after they got organized before they were ready to start building a line.
The beginnings and organization of a co-op would start from necessity and result from a local grassroots effort to bring electricity to an area.
And each one had a group of people who were the original incorporators. These were the guys that signed the papers, took it to the courthouse, got things underway.
Following the incorporation, there would be a meeting to elect a board of directors, a process unchanged today. Directors had to be co-op members, and they exercised the same voting privilege as any customer member.
They would be responsible for hiring the manager and just making sure the finances were all there. Some very brave people. You know how conservative farmers are in the Ozarks. Imagine going up when that co-op was formed and signing your name to a form that guaranteed you were going to pay back a $100,000 loan, or as time went by, maybe a $300,000 loan or even a $1 million loan.
This was very successful. Again, only 1 out of 10 had electricity at that time before the REA. By 1941, 4 out of 10 did. And as the REA continued later on, by 1951, 9 out of 10 had electricity. One can't emphasize enough the importance of this, of creating these generating plants operated by people in the communities to provide this service, because it removes some of the drudgery of rural life.
Look, one of the things that economists talk about is economic growth is all related to productivity, doing more with less. And electricity allows people to do more with less. You have these large increases in productivity. These large increases in productivity translate into increases in revenue, higher wages, profits for firms.
If you look at electricity, think of it in terms of power. I mean, we tend to think of it in terms of light or the things that run off electricity. But it's a fundamental change in the way power is produced and, more importantly, transmitted.
Electricity is work in portable form. I mean, it takes the work that you would do with muscle and it does it with the flip of a switch.
You know, power used to be created and then moved mechanically. If you think of a steam engine or a water wheel or whatever it is, to get that power that's produced, you have to run it through shafts or through belts or whatever. Now with electricity, you can move it through wires, which means you can move it at enormous distances. You can run it up your wall. It's very flexible. So now people in their homes and businesses in their factories can access power and use it in ways that were just, I mean, literally unimagined until it came along.
People didn't have refrigeration, so they needed ice. We talk about the ice box. There literally was an ice box, and they used big chunks of ice. And these were made in great big industrial complexes. One town that comes to mind is Van Buren, Missouri, on Current River. They had an ice company there, and they had generators in there that ran on steam that would generate just enough electricity to meet their needs. Eventually, they expanded enough that they were able to supply electricity to the whole town. But those lines ended at the city limits. It was generally very low voltage, just enough to run a few lights and that sort of thing.
In some instances, particularly in rural settings, families would, in a limited way, generate their own electricity using Delco units, 32-volt generators that ran on kerosene and rechargeable batteries. Throughout the Ozarks, powering the progress and development of communities would often be hydroelectricity and the increasing construction of dams in the area, an effective method of generating electricity and also providing important flood control. In some instances, these dams also generated controversy. In 1929, construction began on Bagnell Dam, resulting in the Lake of the Ozarks Reservoir. During construction, it was the largest man-made lake in the United States and one of the largest in the world, with a surface area of 55,000 acres and more than 1,100 miles of shoreline. Remarkably, the dam was completed in 2 short years. Other significant hydroelectricity and flood control projects would continue with the construction of Bull Shoals and Table Rock dams.
I wasn't aware of this, but actually Bull Shoals and Table Rock were developed as a 1-2 punch sort of thing. Both projects were dependent on the other one, and Bull Shoals was built first. And I don't know exactly what was going on. The reading I have done, there was a very small group of conservation-minded people who thought it would ruin the fishing, didn't want to see the dams come in. There were certainly some landowners that weren't very happy about it, but the need for power was so desperate at those times, they had to have it.
It wasn't so much that the people of the Ozarks resented electricity and wanted to stay in the dark ages and didn't want electricity. They just didn't want to lose their farms, didn't want to lose their land. And that's been a common story with any of those dams that have been constructed through the years.
The other aspect of that was flood control too. A lot of areas, even if somebody owned land there, a lot of times they couldn't use it because of the floodwaters. And I would have to say, if it wasn't for the electric cooperatives and the lobbying they did, certainly Table Rock would never have been built. And I suspect the other dams as well.
During construction of the dams, local residents would still enjoy the rivers in their remaining and timelessly appealing condition.
I remember when I was a boy floating during the week. You had the river to yourself during the week. It was unbelievable.
An often sensitive topic during construction of these new dams would be the sometimes necessary relocation of entire communities and their longtime cemeteries.
They came in, they had no telling how many cemeteries that they were going to have to move that were on these lower areas, bottomlands really.
And because of the building of the dam, they had to move the cemeteries from the low lines, and they'd taken them to higher ground, and they notified the people to come to the cemeteries to receive their people that were buried there, and they removed the caskets and things that was there into other places and cemeteries so it wouldn't be flooded by the water.
There were hundreds of cemeteries, because a lot of these were just little family cemeteries in the flood basins, but there were hundreds of these that were moved to higher ground throughout the Ozarks. And you can go to the different Army Corps of Engineers district offices, and they'll usually have old files with lists of the graves, or at least the known graves that were moved. A lot of these graves were just marked by rocks.
While some small communities were relocated or perhaps disappeared, larger ones would be noticeably altered.
When you come into where it's Kimberly Bridge, Kimberly City now, you'll notice I'd have to show it to you, there's a road that goes down through one of the resorts. Well, that was the old highway, went down and went around the hill and then back and then curved back again, and that old bridge is right underneath the new one that's there now, the big high one,
A lot of the structures in the flood basins were the ones that weren't able to be moved. They were eventually just demolished. The human interest side of electricity for most people in the Ozarks was a much more positive story. You have those negative stories of people who lost their land because of hydroelectricity generating dams, but those people were a real minority, and I think you probably have more of those positive human interest stories.
At the forefront and central to the success of bringing electricity to rural areas were extension agents who went out and physically mapped counties, whether rural or more populated areas. In less populated areas, 3 customers per mile was an early goal. In addition, they helped identify and encourage potential board members for developing co-ops.
And the extension agents would go out and get people interested in getting electricity would identify how many people are interested, how many people would pay the $5 fee that you had to pay back in those early days to join the co-op, to be a member owner of the electric co-op, to get it off the ground in the first place. You know, now $5 back in the Depression era, that was a lot of money. And a lot of that $5 membership fees came from egg money that was very carefully hoarded by the women. But they were very instrumental. I can't say enough about what the ladies did to get these projects off the ground. Sometimes behind the scenes, but sometimes in a more formal fashion as directors.
Co-op leaders were committed to their organization and to successfully bringing electricity to their areas, sometimes making unusual but helpful efforts. Raymond Ferris was elected to the Ozark Electric Cooperative Board of Directors in 1948, when the co-op was only 10 years old. At the time, there were 5,000 area farmers still waiting to receive electricity.
Story I've heard many times that many people didn't have the $5 fee. And these incorporators, as they went around signing up members, I mean, they had to have numbers. And so in some cases, they would either advance them the money. In Mr. Ferris's case, he had a man who was a critical link in getting a project completed, really needed him to sign up, and the guy just didn't have the money.
I know we went to one fella, and he wouldn't sign up. He said, I don't know if I can pay that minimum or not. And I said to him, I said, well, if you'll sign, we need you to finish out this 5 mile. If you'll sign up, I'll pay your first dues. And then, if you don't want it, you can unhook then if you don't want. But I don't know of anybody that asked us to take them off.
Something else they did, they would often accept chickens, maybe jars of milk and things like that in trade for the membership fee.
Raymond Ferris retired from the board in 1972. In 2006, the Verona substation, where the first REA lines in southwest Missouri were energized in 1938, was dedicated in his honor. Also important in these early days were home demonstration agents, women who would visit property owners and share the benefits and possibilities of electricity, providing examples of how this new technology and available appliances could enhance their lives and helping encourage families to become co-op members.
In a lot of the histories I've seen, there were many women on boards, but it makes perfect sense because it was the women that really had the most to gain.
Sure, I think you can look at it reasonably and say that women would benefit more from electricity in those early days than men would, because a lot of the labor-saving appliances that you could purchase back in the 1930s and 40s were household-type appliances, or you could buy an ice box. You could buy an electric range, you could buy an electric iron.
Mom would heat an iron they called sad irons that sat on top of the stove, and it had a handle that fit over that iron and clicked onto those sad irons. She also had some solid irons too, and she would use pot holders to hold those and use them. But we never had an ironing board during those years. She always did the ironing on the kitchen table. Never had an ironing board until we finally got electricity years later.
If you start thinking about the household chores they did, you know, everything from doing the laundry, cooking on a wood cook stove in August, no running water inside, so every chore they did started by pumping water from a well, heating it on the stove, that sort of thing. So definitely it lightened the burden for the housewife in a big way.
I can remember them with a huge big old iron kettle in the yard, heating the water. There was a fire underneath that kettle, and they used washboards and homemade soap to scrub that soap onto the clothes and then go up and down on the washboard to clean those clothes.
Dairy farming was also a significant contributor to electrifying the region, and the REA and co-ops were important partners to its rise and success. It was important, perhaps critical to the REA and co-ops as a strong and tangible way to pay for expanding lines, especially in sparsely populated areas.
Some of the biggest proponents of rural electrification were the dairy farmers because your herd size was limited by, how many cows can you milk by hand? So once electricity came along, they could double the size of their herd and do less work. Also, to have a grade A dairy, you had to have electricity. And a lot of sour milk got poured out in those early days because they just couldn't keep it cool.
Well, we kept the milk in the spring. There was a little bridge across this little creek here, and had a cart, called a milk carts, and you carried them down there and put it in the spring every day. And then after we got electricity, then Dad bought a milk machine.
Electricity to rural areas ushers in the age of the dairy farming Ozarks. That's really what, that was the main thing that in the rural Ozarks that electricity did, because all of a sudden you could buy an electric milking machine and put it on your farm. You could buy a freezer to keep the milk in back in the days when the milk trucks didn't run on a daily basis.
Well, we built a milk parlor, got milk machine. Before we milked by hand. We milked 25 at that time, yeah. Milked them by hand. The only thing we got a milk machine, that helped out a lot, yeah. Milked them in a hurry then.
With all of this activity going on, you've got milk companies expanding in the area for whole milk, not just cheese and cream anymore. And so this just explodes. And by the 1950s, the Ozarks is one of the nation's leading dairy producing regions.
As soon as practical, work would begin to wire individual homes and farms. Generally, this was done by individual contractors, many of these specializing in helping build rural systems. They would hire local workers to dig post holes for posts and to clear right-of-ways. Before linemen would arrive to connect and energize a system, a percentage of members who had signed up had to have their property wired and ready.
I will tell you an interesting story. This happened up in the town of St. James. A woman there was so desperate to get electricity that she wrote a letter to the co-op and said she would trade her brood mare if someone would come out and wire her house. And she said it was a good mare and had plowed many a garden in Phelps County. So there was no indication of whether they took her up on that offer, though.
Well, we got electricity in 1949, I think in the summer. The first thing I remember is the guys coming wiring the house. Two guys came and I don't know, I think it took them at least 2 or 3 days. I can remember them coming more than once. Dad and my brother, they kind of helped them. And
yeah, we had a fellow by the name of Glenn Merle, Frank Lawrence. They were the electrician, but we helped them wire it.
These old houses are made out of oak, and it's hard to drill through everything.
And that wall over there has got a 6-foot bit. He hung it in couldn't get it out. It's still in the wall. Couldn't get the bit out of that angle, see? They had to bore through the angle to get the wire down. So he had another bit. We bored a hole and got the wire down to the plug-in.
When the house was done, and then they learned how to do it, so they wired the barn and the chicken house and everything themselves.
As you can imagine, it was also very expensive to have your home wired. When I say expensive, maybe $60, maybe $100, which was big money back then. And that was kind of a deal breaker for a lot of families. So what happened very early on, REA began making loans for plumbing and wiring. And a member could come in, they would pay about 80% of it, so just a little bit of money up front and then just pay a little at a time on your electric bill. So without that, it may not have ever happened.
During this time, linemen were nearby, actively pulling and stringing lines ready to connect individual property owners.
They went out, they were brave. They were also desperate. If you can imagine, this was the Great Depression, so a job was pretty scarce to come by. A lot of them maybe had some training as a electrician. There just weren't a lot of lineman schools then, so I'm not sure. I think it was all on-the-job training from what I've heard. Of course, not a lot of safety equipment. It was rare for anybody to have a hard hat until, probably the 60s. So you see linemen up on poles with fedoras on, and pretty tough occupation.
A tough occupation, also due to the Ozarks' terrain and topography, some of the most rugged and challenging land anywhere.
Any of us who've been out in the Ozarks, it's not part of the Springfield Plain, not part of the nice, smooth prairies, knows that it's no easy task getting around. And certainly, if you've ever tried to drive a post out in the rocky ground, you know that can be a challenge in and of itself.
They would do things in a kind of an assembly line fashion, where a whole team of people would go out armed with crosscut saws, axes, and just whatever tools they had, would go out and clear right away. Following right behind them was a crew that was digging the holes for the poles. Then behind them would come another crew, and they would frame the poles. So the poles would be laying on the ground, they'd be putting cross arms or whatever kind of hardware it needed. And then along would come another team, and this might be the largest one. There might be 5 or 6 people who would put these poles in the ground. In those early days, we've got a lot of pictures of people setting poles with pike poles. So literally a stick with a metal point on the end, and they'd get underneath it, and a whole bunch of people, and just through sheer brute strength, stand this pole up.
Well, I was pretty fresh on the job. They pulled me out, and I had to work as a swamper on a pole setter. And of course, they set these poles with an A-frame on a straight bed truck. It was just a A-frame, and of course, I had to man the cable to tie around the pole. I had to hook the pole up in a certain place to raise it up, and then he dropped it into the hole. Then we had a crew come along that, straightened the pole and tamped it in, put the dirt back in the hole. That was another crew that did that.
Coming up next would be the linemen, who would string the lines and make the actual connection to the property. And then one day, house by house, area by area, the lights came on. Strongly, positively, and sometimes humorously changing the life of everyone.
And Dad owned the school buses, so he loaded us kids up in the school bus and took us way over on a hill and turned the lights all on. And we never saw lights like that before. And it just looked like a big city, you know. And that was the first day they turned the lights on. Dad took us over there. And we really thought we had something.
So out comes the co-op, they set the meter, and our house happened to be on the same transformer as the one at the school. So the boys said, we just well set this one too while we're here, and they did. And when we got ready to go across the road to the pie supper, everybody was pretty excited about the electric coming. Dad said, well, just leave the pole light on so we can see to get home. And so we did that. Boy, it started getting dark, and the lights in that schoolhouse was unbelievable how bright they were, And to look across the road at our house and that pole light burning, it was unbelievable. It looked like the sun was coming up, and the talk and the chatter at the school that evening was just totally unbelievable how exciting that really was.
Of course, in those days, they had, I thought it was really interesting, your minimum was $3, I believe it was, and you could get 30 kilowatts, and that was it, and then you had to start paying more. Now, we didn't put electricity in when that happened, but I had an uncle that did, and his wife, she'd read the meter every day, and if she used more than 1 kilowatt, she'd light the lamps the next day so she'd use more than the 30.
Well, we made sure that we read the meter on a certain day. It had to be a certain day that we had to, Dad taught us at a certain day to read it.
Hundreds of photos exist today that were taken by photographers for the Farm Administration, documenting the impact and progress of the REA. One of these, taken in 1943, featured 16-year-old Barbara Voris.
Dad told me to go to the pole and read the meter, and I did, and that's as far as I went.
The photograph almost instantly became an iconic image and promotion of the growing REA efforts across the country, appearing on posters, in textbooks, and in REA offices across America. In 2015, she once again proudly represented and championed the REA in a Then and Now photo for rural Missouri, a statewide publication received by members of Missouri's electric co-ops.
I talked to many old timers who were there when the lights came on for a family for the first time. And one house, of course, the woman of the house, very excited to be getting electricity. They turned the lights on, and immediately she says, "Turn them off, turn them off. We're not turning those lights on again till I get a chance to clean." And of course, when you're living with candles and lanterns, you have no idea how dirty your house is getting.
On at least one unusual occasion, the lights didn't come on as planned. The setting was Rose Hill Baptist Church near Willard, Missouri.
We decided to put the lights in, or they did. I was just a kid, and after they got them installed, the pastor, Bob Holloway, a mighty fine man, he decided to have a little ceremony one Sunday night. So I went to it, and my dad, and we stationed the deacons at the lamps, these cool oil lamps. And when Brother Bob gave the command, why everybody blow the lamps out, and he threw the switch. Well, he did, and we were in the dark. So kind of a little bit panicky, and this old gentleman, he said, now don't get excited. He said, remember, this got to come all the way from Mount Vernon. It's going to take a little while to get there. And nobody knew any different. We didn't know anything about electricity.
We talk about, in Missouri, we're very unique in the cooperative world. We have what we call a three-tier system. So the first tier would be your distribution co-op, White River Valley, Webster Electric, Berry Electric in this area. The second tier up would be the transmission co-ops. In this area, that would be Show Me Power and Camo Power. And what they do, they provide the transmission lines. In the early days, they actually had their own power plants. Nowadays, not so much. So they would move the high voltage electricity down to the distribution co-op and hand it off there. That third tier is Associated Electric Cooperative, based here in Springfield, and they are responsible for all of the generation for all the systems. So they have two major coal-fired power plants. They have a whole series of natural gas-fired power plants, a number of just smaller gas-fired peaking units. They also operate wind farms, northwest Missouri, and Oklahoma and Kansas. And of course, they're responsible for wheeling power from the hydroelectric dams in this area.
James McNabb was hired as manager of engineering for Associated Electric Cooperative in 1962, becoming the fifth person hired by an organization that now employs approximately 700 individuals. Retiring after 38 years of service, he is frequently credited with developing Missouri's modern electric grid.
If you were to pick a thing to describe him with that would make him most proud, I think the electric system in this region would be his favorite accomplishment. He was a very, very good electrical engineer. So understanding how power would flow and where additions to the system could be the most beneficial was something that he did very, very well.
In 2014, White River Valley Electric Cooperative CEO Chris Hammond encouraged the Association of Missouri Electric Cooperatives to create a professional award in Jim McNabb's honor. It recognizes individuals making an impacting engineering design for cooperative member owners all across Missouri and Oklahoma. The Jim McNabb Engineering Achievement Award was presented for the first time in 2015. Providing support to the professional three-tier electric entities is AMEC, the Association of Missouri Electric Cooperatives, a statewide organization founded in 1937 that represents Missouri's 47 electric co-ops. Located in Jefferson City, the organization provides ways to help member co-ops be collectively successful and efficient in ways they would be unable to accomplish individually.
And one of these is cooperation among cooperatives. So if we can lend a helping hand to our neighbors, that's what we do. And a lot of things that co-ops just couldn't afford to do on their own, by pooling their resources, they could get the job done. One of these was safety training, desperately needed. You know, as men started working hotlines, in the early days they could disconnect the lines and do whatever they wanted and nobody really minded. But as electricity got used more extensively, you couldn't do that anymore, and you had to start working lines hot. And safety became a real concern, so they hired two people. One of them worked north of the Missouri River and the other worked south of the Missouri River. And they would travel around to each system. They would put on safety classes. They would teach pole top rescue, things like that. And that was one of the earliest things that the association did.
Longtime and popular AMEC support also includes the publication of Rural Missouri Magazine that goes out to every member of each co-op in the state, 550,000 readers. An invaluable strength of AMEC and the unity of its members is demonstrated during severe weather, such as ice storms.
One of the greatest things that we hope we never need is our mutual assistance program. And that's what happens if we have a major ice storm. Generally, it won't hit every part of the state. There'll be some areas that are okay. So we can get linemen to come in and bring equipment and materials to the system that's in harm's way. That started in 1948.
Storms can be a different deal. They really can. Sometimes you just get home from work and get cleaned up a little bit and time to go to bed, and the lightning's flashing in your window on the west side of your house, and you already know that it's not long and you're going to get your boots on and go to work.
There exists and continues to be a strong sense of pride, ability, and family among electrical employees and co-op members. Perhaps no more clearly evident than when a massive ice storm similar to one in 1948 struck the Ozarks in 2007, with power outages lasting for weeks in some areas. Another major storm extending from Branson and to the east in 2009 was even more devastating.
Co-op linemen don't give up. They just don't give up. They stay there until it is done, no matter how long it takes. They're going to get it done. Yeah.
There was a story in one of the co-ops. There was a family, and the mother was about to give birth. So she goes into the hospital, and her baby was born very premature. So nowadays, they put them in an incubator, and you'd go home fairly soon. Well, this little boy, he needed to stay in that incubator. But the family didn't have electricity, so the word got down to the Cooperative. They built him an incubator. They also built a mile of line, literally in a day or two, so that by the time that family came home, not only did they have electricity, but they had a little handmade incubator to keep him alive. So that was one of those heartwarming stories that only at an electric cooperative would something like that happen.
Support, assistance, a very real sense of family and community seems to identify the Missouri co-ops. Early on, the Missouri State Rural Electrification Administration bought a large circus tent, a semi-truck, and chairs, and would provide these for annual co-op meetings.
And they would take that around for annual meetings because these meetings would be quite large, and most places didn't have an auditorium big enough to house it.
These annual meetings encouraged and fostered this ever-present sense of family, a festive setting that provided members with important information and the opportunity to vote on issues that would affect them, and to enjoy the company of fellow co-op members.
Co-ops, I think, have a very good reputation as being working for the consumer. They're owned by the consumer, so they like to work for the people that own them. And they like for the consumer to believe that they're doing the right thing, not only providing them with electricity, but in the case of the weather alert program, working with the youth and all those other activities that they are involved with.
The story of the electrification of the Ozarks is about people. Collectively, the residents of the Ozarks and their shared experiences. It's a story of people, of a changing culture, terrain, lifestyles, and possibilities. People who united in progressive, skilled, and supporting ways to make this goal a reality.
Communications, health, transportation, manufacturing, all of these types of things that we see that we take for granted we wouldn't even be able to have without electricity. It makes the modern world possible, it really does.
I don't think that electricity has done anything unique in the Ozarks. It might have come to some places later than it did other places, but in the end, electricity offers the same thing that it does every place else. And if anything, it offers the Ozarks, the people of the region, the ability to be more like people elsewhere.
That might be a good way to end it. You know, nowadays, everything you buy plugs into the wall. You know, even from your battery-operated devices, they all have a charger. It's hard to buy anything that doesn't plug into the electric circuit. So the job's never really done. We're constantly updating it. The job of wiring the Ozarks is never going to be finished. It's just going to keep getting better.